Greetings, Hegelians. I was looking forward, of course, to being with you in Warsaw in person for this historic Congress, but unfortunately that isn't possible at this time. So here we are, meeting on a screen, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with by now. So thank you for joining me here to discuss a topic related to Hegel's aesthetics and the theme of this year's Congress, which is freedom, which, of course, is also a constant theme in Hegel's philosophy. In fact, it's hard to think of any part of it that is not concerned with freedom in some way. The development of freedom, moving toward freedom, the realization of freedom, it's framed almost everywhere around freedom. And this is no less the case in Hegel's aesthetics. In fact, early in these lectures here, he says that freedom is the highest destiny of spirit. And interestingly, on the same page, he describes two immediate impediments to this freedom. One, he says, is that we are confronted by the unfree, by the purely objective as the necessity of nature. And at once there arises the demand that this opposition be reconciled. So there's us, right, the subjects, and then there's what's objective, which is nature, in opposition to us, in an opposition that Hegel says demands reconciliation. Well, this process of reconciliation is obviously a very long one, and one, of course, that is ultimately accomplished not in art, but in philosophy. So in this presentation, we'll be looking at this process from the perspective of Hegel's aesthetics and the role that art plays in this self-liberation. Now, systematically speaking, art comes very near the end of Hegel's philosophy, but the passage I just quoted about being confronted by the unfreedom of nature and demanding that this opposition be reconciled reminds me of something we find much earlier in the philosophy of nature. And why bring up the philosophy of nature, which of course is the one part of Hegel's philosophy that almost everyone ignores? Well, where does spirit come from? It doesn't just appear in the first paragraphs of the philosophy of spirit. Instead, it comes from nature, emerges out of nature, Hegel says. And if we go back to the beginning of the philosophy of nature, we find that he says there, nature confronts us as a riddle and a problem whose solution both attracts and repels us. Attracts us because spirit has a presentiment of itself in nature, and repels us because nature appears as an alien existence in which spirit does not find itself. What I like about this passage is how it sets up the problem of the philosophy of nature, and also the philosophy of spirit that follows it in the encyclopedia, which is why I wanted to start here in nature, which Hegel has just described as a riddle. The actual word he uses is Rätsel, which does mean riddle, and also puzzle, mystery, enigma, all of which are appropriate because that is how nature confronts us, as a mystery or a problem in need of a solution, an enigma that we need to free ourselves from, or going back to Hegel's aesthetics, an opposition with which we must be reconciled, and therefore something we can't ignore. So how does this opposition and its eventual reconciliation come about? Well, if we skip ahead to the other end of the philosophy of nature, we find one of its most interesting parts, since this is where Hegel links the philosophy of nature to the philosophy of spirit. Now, think back to the logic part of the encyclopedia and how this part ends, something like the idea freely resolving to let the moment of its particularity go forth. It goes forth as nature in this case, something esoteric like that. At the end of the philosophy of nature, thankfully, we're on firmer ground, since it is literal ground that we're on in nature with the transition to spirit, because something like what Hegel philosophically conjectures must actually have happened. This is where he revisits the concept of life. And I say revisits because life isn't actually a concept of nature for Hegel like magnetism or digestion, but instead it's a concept of logic, where we find it near the end in the doctrine of the concept itself. But it actually shows up a lot earlier than that, because Hegel uses life as an example of dialectic in his introduction to the encyclopedia as a whole. There he's talking about dialectic not as something that we do as philosophers, or even as a way of thinking, but as what he calls an immanent process, something we observe in thought as well as in natural phenomena, such as life itself. And what he's talking about is actually how it comes to an end, how life ends, not from any external cause, but from within. There are, of course, thousands of external ways to die. You could have an accident, you could be injured, you can get a disease. These are all arbitrary events and contingent upon other things. And this is not what interests Hegel about death, because even if none of those arbitrary things happens, we're still going to die, necessarily. Any living thing will at some point cease living. It will come to an end, its own end, as determined by itself rather than anything outside itself. Immortality, which would just be going on and on forever, would be an example of what Hegel calls bad infinity. So how does this figure into the end of the philosophy of nature? Well, this is where spirit first appears, the spirit that will go on to be the subject of the philosophy of spirit, the spirit that arises or proceeds from nature. So how does this happen? Does it freely resolve to let the moment of its particularity go forth? Thankfully, no. Hegel does not recycle this transition from the end of logic. Instead, he says that everything that's alive, everything living, dies. Every living thing contains what he calls the inborn germ of death. So at the end of the philosophy of nature, where Hegel is talking about life, and it's really animal life at this point, the animal organism, he calls it, exists in opposition to the world and lacks the conceptual thinking necessary to grasp in thought and overcome this opposition. Instead, he says the absence of opposition to which the organism progresses is the repose of the dead. Hegel describes this death as the self-induced destruction of the individual. Self-induced because, as we've seen, life is self-negating, meaning it contains its opposite, death, within itself, like an inborn germ. So death is actually part of life. Life negates itself. Life and death are not two different things, but part of the same process, an immanent dialectical process. Now from this death, Hegel says, from this dead husk proceeds a more beautiful nature, which is spirit, which is also a very interesting word choice, I think, because what proceeds from the death of nature is a more beautiful nature. And this more beautiful nature is spirit. In this same paragraph at the end of the philosophy of nature, Hegel says quite dramatically that the goal of nature is to destroy itself, to break through its husk of immediate sensuous existence, to consume itself like the phoenix in order to come forth from this externality rejuvenated as spirit. Nature has become an other to itself in order to recognize itself again as idea and to reconcile itself with itself. Now, isn't that Hegel's whole philosophy right there at the end of that passage? People are always asking for a brief summary of Hegel's philosophy, and I think that he just gave us one. It was a little dense, perhaps, a little esoteric, again, but I think we can see him saying it there. And the way he's saying it is interesting because we usually think of nature and spirit as different domains for Hegel, don't we? They're covered in different parts of the encyclopedia. But here, Hegel is saying that spirit comes from nature, is a part of nature. In fact, is a more beautiful nature. Spirit just doesn't know it yet, at this level anyway. Nature has kind of split itself in half, and its other half, spirit, in a finite sense at this point, is now confronting it, in opposition to it, and hopefully on track, as Hegel says, to reconcile itself with itself. And right at the end, he says, this reconciliation of spirit with nature and with actuality is alone its genuine liberation. So nature has destroyed itself, in some sense, in order for the idea or the concept to emerge as the opposite of itself in individual minds or spirit. And if that's the good news, that we're on the road to liberation and freedom, then I guess the bad news is that as it becomes aware of itself as distinct from nature, spirit also becomes aware of its dependence on nature, and therefore its lack of freedom. I think of this as spirit's out of the frying pan and into the fire moment. And it's actually where I started back at the beginning of this talk in Hegel's Aesthetics, where he says that we are confronted by the unfree, by the purely objective as the necessity of nature. And what is spirit's reaction to this confrontation? Hegel says at once there arises the demand that this opposition be reconciled. He also adds here the opposing view. Remember, I said there were two impediments to this realization or actualization of freedom. On the other side, Hegel says, the side opposite nature, a similar opposition is found within the subjective sphere itself. And what this shows is that Hegel definitely likes to keep things interesting, because previously he said there's a conflict, an opposition between the subjective and the objective, between spirit and nature. And now he's saying there's an opposition within subjectivity itself. On the one hand, he goes on, whatever is universal and independent, the universal laws of the right, the good, the true, etc., all belong to freedom. While on the other hand, there are the impulses of mankind, feelings, inclinations, passions, everything comprised in the concrete heart of man as an individual. This opposition, too, goes on to a battle, a contradiction, and in this strife there arise all longings, the deepest grief, torment, and the loss of satisfaction itself. Hegel says, look at animals, look at how they live in peace with themselves, with nature. Animals are part of nature, but spirit has left this harmony behind. In the spiritual nature of man, he says, duality and inner conflict burgeon, and in their contradiction he is tossed about. For in the inner as such, in pure thought, man cannot hold out. He needs also sensuous existence, feeling, the heart, emotion. In the immediacy of life, he says, we press on for immediate satisfaction. And in this case, he means very immediate. Like, we feel hungry, we look for food. We feel tired, we find a place to sleep. This is satisfaction at the lowest level, what he calls the system of sensuous needs. But this is just bad infinity again, because if you eat something today, you'll just be hungry again tomorrow, meaning we can never fully satisfy or free ourselves from these wants and needs. That's on the physical side. Hegel says we can also find some relative, but still not absolute satisfaction on the subjective side, the intellectual side. The ignorant man is not free, he says, because what confronts him is an alien world, something outside him on which he depends without his having made this foreign world for himself, and therefore without being at home in it, as in something his own. Consequently, he says, man strives further in the realm of spirit to obtain satisfaction and freedom in knowing and willing and learning and actions. The impulse of curiosity, the pressure for knowledge from the lowest level up to the highest rung of philosophical insight arises only from the struggle to cancel this situation of unfreedom and to make the world one's own in one's ideas and one's thought. So, we've seen Hegel describe the human quest for freedom on both sides, objective and subjective, and as such, both remain relative, restricted, one-sided, what he would call finite, and for that reason, not totally free. So what does Hegel mean by freedom? Well, he's just given us a glimpse of it there, I think. He says to make the world one's own in one's ideas and one's thought. This, he suggests, would cancel our situation of unfreedom. More fully, he says, freedom is the highest destiny of spirit. You'll remember I began with that line. Now, here it is in context. What comes next is Hegel saying that freedom consists in this, that in what confronts the subject, there is nothing alien, and it is not a limitation or a barrier. On the contrary, the subject finds himself in it. All distress and every misfortune has vanished. The subject is reconciled with the world, satisfied in it, and every opposition and contradiction is resolved. Well, that definitely sounds like a good situation to be in. Unfortunately, it's not easily achieved. So how does Hegel say that spirit becomes free? Well, if we go back to the philosophy of subjective spirit for a minute, he says actual freedom is not something immediately in the mind, but something to be produced by spirit's activity. In science, by which he means philosophy, in science we have to regard spirit as the producer of its own freedom. So how does it do this? Well, essentially that's what's happening throughout the philosophy of spirit, the third part of the encyclopedia. Like most things for Hegel, such as the encyclopedia as a whole, the philosophy of subjective spirit itself has three parts. which he describes as stages in the liberation of spirit. Those stages are, first, finding a world before it as a presupposed world. Second, generating a world as posited by itself. And finally, gaining freedom from it and in it. It's freedom in the world, yet from the world at the same time. This, in fact, is Hegel's division of the philosophy of spirit into subjective spirit, or simple subjectivity, that seems to find itself in a seemingly objective world, and objective spirit, which is the world that the mind or spirit creates for itself in morality, civil society, the state, world history, and so on. Interestingly, Hegel calls both of these spheres together, subjective and objective spirit, finite, meaning they're limited, one-sided. It's also interesting that art does not fall within these spheres. The way Hegel puts it, art has placed itself in the same sphere as religion and philosophy. And the three of them, of course it's three, art, religion, and philosophy, make up the final infinite sphere of absolute spirit. So how did art end up in this elite group? Art is something made by the human spirit that exists in the objective world. So why doesn't Hegel cover it in objective spirit? Well, the simple reason he gives is that art is simply one way of bringing to our minds and expressing the deepest interests of mankind and the most comprehensive truths of spirit. Well, yes, art certainly does do that, but how? And in what way that gives it such a prominent place in Hegel's philosophy? Well, let's go back to the beginning of Hegel's Aesthetics. Do you know how he opens the lectures on aesthetics? It's actually kind of funny because he begins by saying how hard it is to say what aesthetics is, mainly because the word aesthetics itself is the wrong word, since it just refers to sensation. Though by then it was already in common usage for philosophy of art, so he says he'll let it stand at that. But what does he say his real subject is? Well, he defines it as the spacious realm of the beautiful. So in the time that we have left, we have to consider what beauty means for Hegel. He describes it as a specific way of expressing and representing the true. And what is true for Hegel is the idea, the unfolding of the concept. He says art sets truth before our minds in the mode of sensuous configuration, a configuration that has a loftier, deeper sense and meaning, yet without having the aim of making the concept as such, in its universality, comprehensible. For it is precisely the unity of the concept with the individual appearance that is the essence of the beautiful. I think one of Hegel's most striking statements in all of his lectures on aesthetics is when he says that it is impossible for the understanding to comprehend beauty. Now, understanding something sounds like a good thing, right? But whenever Hegel mentions it, it's almost always a bad thing, because the understanding is just ordinary thinking that has not risen to the level of rationality, or what he calls speculation or the speculative. So when Hegel says understanding, it's usually negative. As in this case, where he says the understanding cannot comprehend beauty. And that's because the understanding doesn't function at the dialectical level necessary to appreciate beauty. We know that for Hegel, philosophy is dialectical. And it turns out that art is for him as well. And unfortunately, the understanding or the ordinary intellect cannot grasp it. Why not? Well, a minute ago, Hegel said that it is precisely the unity of the concept with the individual appearance that is the essence of the beautiful. And here's how he says the understanding operates. Instead of penetrating to this unity, the understanding clings fast to the differences, exclusively in their independence, separation, by regarding reality as something quite different from ideality, the sensuous from the concept, the subjective from the objective. And it thinks, the understanding thinks, that such oppositions cannot be reconciled and unified. Thus, understanding remains in the field of the finite, the one-sided, the untrue, while the beautiful is in itself infinite and free. Hegel has an interesting way of describing the human condition. He says that the human is an amphibious creature. Amphibious because we live in two worlds that contradict one another, with the result that now conscissness wanders about in this contradiction and is driven from one side to the other, cannot find satisfaction for itself. For on the one side, we see man imprisoned in the common world of reality and earthly temporality, borne down by need and poverty, hard pressed by nature, enmeshed in matter, mastered and carried away by natural impulses and passions. On the other side, he lifts himself to eternal ideas, to a realm of thought and freedom. Hegel says these dramatic oppositions have not at all been invented by the pedantry of philosophy. No, he says instead they have always preoccupied and troubled human consciousness. And for a very long time, for thousands of years, we have had art as a way of reconciling these oppositions, which is why Hegel describes works of art as the first reconciling middle term between pure thought and what is merely external, sensuous and transient, between nature and finite reality and the infinite freedom of conceptual thinking. You'll notice that philosophy, of course, comes out on top, the infinite freedom of conceptual thinking, but art is still freeing in its own limited way, in a special way, Hegel says, namely by displaying even the highest truth sensuously, bringing it thereby nearer to the senses, to feeling. And one final thing I should point out is that there's actually a double reconciliation going on here, because it's not just subjective and objective that are being brought back together, self and world, but also the self with itself. I've suggested this a few times, but I want to make sure to bring it out explicitly here, because just a minute ago, Hegel was talking about not only being hard-pressed by nature and enmeshed in matter, but also about being mastered and carried away by natural impulses and passions. So there are both external and interior oppositions and contradictions at play here, which is why Hegel says that the beauty of art is able to dissolve and reduce to unity the opposition and contradiction between the abstractly self-concentrated spirit and nature. That's a little more complicated than it needs to be, but he's saying that what art does, the beauty of art does, is dissolve and unify the opposition between, let's just call it spirit and nature, between the mind and the world. Both nature of external phenomena, now that's what we've been talking about most of the time here, but then he splits nature. You have the nature of external phenomena, the seemingly objective world, and that of inner subjective feeling and emotion. So I think we can see that as the reconciliation of spirit and world, and spirit and itself, which of course makes spirit all the more free. And this is why Hegel speaks of our need for art. Not our wish, not our desire or whim, but the universal and absolute need for art. And I also think that's what's unique about Hegel's philosophy of art, that this is not an aesthetics of art as a source of pleasure or free play or an expression of emotion or naturalistic representation, moral education, any number of aesthetic theories. At the conclusion of his lectures, Hegel says that aesthetics is one of the worthiest tasks that philosophy is capable of completing. For in art we have to do not with any agreeable or useful child's play, but with the liberation of the spirit from the content and forms of finitude, with the presence and reconciliation of the absolute in what is apparent and visible, with an unfolding of the truth that is not exhausted in natural history, but revealed in world history. Art itself is the most beautiful side of that history, and it is the best compensation for hard work in the world and the bitter labor of knowledge. There's obviously so much more to say about this topic, which of course is a good thing and a bad thing. So maybe it was a mistake to try to fit it all in just 20 minutes or however long it's been. So I apologize if I've gone over time, but I really want to thank you for joining me for this presentation. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions, and hopefully also to seeing you in person and probably with shorter hair when the 34th Hegel Congress convenes. Thank you again for your time.